is yes. Okay, so I am going to welcome everyone on behalf of both the Massachusetts Association of Realtors and the Massachusetts Mortgage Bankers Association. I would love to thank everyone for joining us on this really important conversation that we're going to have. In particular, I would love to thank the speakers that we have for this afternoon's program. This will be recorded. And I am going to actually just toss it over to Bryan Brown, who is not only you'll introduce yourself, I know, but he is a board member of the Massachusetts Mortgage Bankers Association, as is Darryl. And so we really appreciate you being willing to moderate this. So, okay, I'm going to pass it to you.
All right, Deb, thanks for the intro. And yes, thank you to all the Mass Mortgage Bankers Association members for joining us today. And thank you, especially a huge welcome to all of our friends and partners over at the Mass Association of Realtors. We really appreciate you all being on today. So the topic of the discussion is Mass New Home Inspection Law.
If I'm in your way, let me know. I'm just listening to a work meeting.
Can you mute everybody?
We need to hold on. We need to mute.
So that's a good point. If Deb can't, please go ahead and just mute yourselves before we get started on this.
I'm going to mute all, and hopefully it won't mute all current and new. Okay, so now I've got to ask all of our speakers to unmute.
Yep, okay, we're good. Yeah, Anthony, just unmute when you have a sec. All right, so topic is Mass New Home Inspection Law, what it means for buyers, sellers, and lenders. Obviously the last couple of years, the real estate industry has undergone a few changes here and there, and this is just another one that's coming down the pike. But the best of the best are always going to educate themselves so they can best help their clients, their buyers and sellers, and through this, and which is why we're all here today. So we have a huge audience. I'm not sure who's doing any real estate in Massachusetts today, but really, really appreciate you all being on. Before we begin, just some housekeeping type stuff. Please mute yourselves if you haven't already. With such a large audience, we can't take questions during the call. So you could feel free to use the chat, type your questions into the chat. We'll answer as many as we can throughout the conversation, but we will very likely answer your questions as we go through, and then we can do a little Q&A at the end as well. All right. So next, let's just quickly introduce our speakers today, so you know who you're hearing from. I'll go first. I'm the moderator. My name is Bryan Brown. I'm with Rate Mortgage, formerly Guaranteed Rate. I'm also an MMBA board member. Been in the mortgage industry for 22 years, at Rate since 2012, and father of 3. I summer in Maine, all that good stuff. So if we're not connected on social media, please reach out to me. Justin, why don't you go next?
Hi, everyone. Justin Davidson. I'm the General Counsel and Director of Government Affairs at MAR. Been with the association now for a dozen years. Before that, some time working in the House of Representatives. So issues like this are right in my wheelhouse. And just a big thank you to MMBA, Debbie, for reaching out and putting this all together for us.
Awesome. Anthony.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, Bryan. Thank you for having me, Debbie. Happy to be here with these panelists. You certainly assembled a group of experts, and I'm happy to be a part. My name is Anthony Lamacchia, broker owner of Lamacchia Realty.
Darryl.
Good afternoon, everyone. Darryl Caffee, Webster Five. I'm the Director of Retail Lending here. Also the Treasurer and Legislative Chair at the MMBA. I've been the chair of our legislative committee for about 6, maybe 7 years now. So I've seen at least 3 legislative cycles. So can't wait to talk about this topic here today. It's seemingly been years in the making, but it's here. So
awesome. Thank you all. All right. So first, let's kick it off with Justin. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the change that's coming, or have sort of said, well, it's not happening until October, I'll kind of figure it out in September. Justin, why don't you get us all on the same page? Tell us a little bit about what is changing, the new guideline changes. So go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Bryan. I'll try and break this down. It is a pretty big law, but I think it really does distill down to two important parts. The first is that soon, as of October 15th, buyers will have the right to inspect a home before they can be bound to purchasing it. And the other key piece is that sellers and their agents will have to provide a required disclosure to potential buyers, notifying them of their right to have the home inspected. So I mean, those are the key pieces. Of course, there's a lot more information, right? This only applies to the purchase of residential properties containing 1 to 4 units. One of the changes, and I think we'll get into sort of the change from the law to the initial regulations to what we have as regulations today. But the buyer will have to have a reasonable time to have the home inspected before they're bound by contract to purchase it. And then importantly, the buyer does not have to have the home inspected. There's a lot of talk out in the industry that this requires buyers to inspect a home. It does not. It just prevents a buyer from saying, I'm not going to waive a home inspection to gain an advantage over other buyers. And in fact, one of the changes that we're successful in is allowing buyers to tell sellers after their offer's been accepted that, hey, I'm not having an inspection. Let's move along. So as I said, it goes into effect for contracts entered into October 15th of this year. So this is a great time to be getting ready for the implementation.
All right. Excellent. Thank you very much, Anthony, and then Darryl. So how did we get here?
Well, we got here because we just lived through a once in a century occurrence with a pandemic that created the lowest inventory in as long as records have been kept. In the winters of 2021, 22, 23, we were down as low as 4,000 homes for sale in Massachusetts, and we're in a state of 7 million people, and there was only 4,000 homes for sale. So because of that, with interest rates still low, particularly in the early part of this decade, there was a tremendous amount of competition for homes. That has since gone away. And these lawmakers and really home inspectors, and I know that some are watching, and they really push this to benefit their industry. It really isn't necessary, and capitalism would have solved it, and that's already what is happening because now inventory is up. Today, as I sit before you, there's 11,500 homes for sale in Massachusetts, and in most home sales, buyers are back to doing home inspections. I know that closer to Boston, particularly earlier this spring, there was still some waiving of home inspections. I know that it happens in one-off fashions, but by and large, buyers are back to doing home inspections. So we got here because of extremely low inventory, which was produced by lower interest rates, and it would have solved itself. So it's unfortunate that this law has come into play because it's really putting both buyers and sellers in certain different disadvantages in certain ways. And I'll get into that further after. But when you ask how we got here, the simple answer is the lowest amount of homes for sale in decades, really since records have been kept.
Okay. Darryl, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, honestly, I think Anthony did a great job kind of speaking to the market and how that's gotten us to this point here today. The only thing I'd add really is thinking about the legislative process. And, one of the things that I always say is stories sell legislation, right? So I think when you have a home buyer who either gets into a home and maybe used every dime they had, or for whatever reason had a little bit of buyer's remorse, it's really a long game real estate. What you end up having is a story being told to a legislator. They hear it, it's sexy, it's easy to understand. They think they can digest it quickly without having that industry knowledge that Anthony kind of spoke to. And before you know it, they start running with this little snowball that turns into a boulder. And that's what puts you in a position like this. It's stories from customers who, for whatever reason, found themselves in a situation that they probably could have predicted, but maybe weren't fully prepared for. And then here we are.
All right. Anthony, you just alluded to some advantages and disadvantages. Elaborate on that if you could.
Well, I could go on for a half an hour, but I won't do that. Let me explain the one that comes to mind the most. For starters, buyer's agents have a fiduciary duty to do everything in the best interest of their buyer and to advocate for their buyer as best as possible to help them achieve a home and achieve the terms and conditions that that are best for them. Now a buyer's agent is essentially going to have their hands tied and be prohibited from delivering a message from a buyer to a listing broker that, hey, this buyer is not doing a home inspection. Because once the seller hears that, then they're not allowed to take that offer, which is, from a regulatory perspective, is kind of laughable. You know, how are they going to enforce this is going to be challenging, but there are competing interests between the fiduciary duty and this law. So there's one disadvantage right there, is a buyer who does want to waive their inspection. I mean, I'm someone that I haven't done a home inspection in 20 years. Now, I'm obviously a very savvy buyer. I've bought nearly 100 homes, but I should have the right to waive an inspection, and I should have a right to convey that message to the listing brokerage, okay? On the seller side, a seller should have a right to ask questions and to obtain all of the knowledge related to all of the offers on their home. And now this information of no inspection is going to be somewhat hidden. Now, I understand, and Justin will do a better job explaining than me, but I understand that in the regulations, they said, well, it can't be on the offer. Are they really going to stop verbal conversations? I have a hard time believing that. But if you're a seller, you should have a right to know what is going to be done to your home and what isn't. And I understand they're trying to go down the road similar to that of the lead paint form, where, hey, buyer's got a right to inspect, buyer's got a right to put seller on notice of inspection, but they're essentially decreasing communication and decreasing the amount of transparency at the early part of the negotiation and early part of the transaction. And, you know, I don't love it, but it is what it is. The law, you know, the horse has left the barn. So there's no getting the horse back in the barn, and we're going to have to deal with it. And listen, our great NAR president, Kevin Sears, says realtors are problem solvers. So, you know, back when the implementation of the settlement came in a year ago, he said, realtors are problem solvers. They'll solve this. And I would say the same, to echo his words for this.
Okay. Justin, you want to elaborate on that at all? He said, you know, that it can't be on the offer. Can you talk about that? There's sort of the mechanics of it.
Yeah, and I think what's important is, you know, when you look at, I'll speak to our forms, right? We put out standardized forms. One of those is a contract to purchase. It's a binding contract for the house that is going to have embedded in it an inspection contingency clause. So to Anthony's point, if outside of the contract, people are talking about what they are going and not going to do throughout the transaction, what's important is go back and look at the contract. What does the contract allow for? So if you've got a buyer agent saying, hey, don't worry, my buyer's not going to do an inspection. Well, if the contract says he can do an inspection, then the buyer has that opportunity no matter what they've told you verbally. So I think that's where you have to sort of think about it. Like, let's go back to the basics of the four corners of the contract. And that's what you need to be if you are a realtor and you're talking to a seller and, you know, you have a buyer that's saying, well, I'm not, even though it's in my contract, I'm not going to do it. Make sure you're instructing them that they need to pay attention to the terms of the contract.
Okay. I guess let's stick with you. What is MAR doing to make sure that realtors are ready?
Yeah, we've been busy on this one. It started with so this was passed back in August of 2024. This was supposed to be in effect December 15th of 2024. So we opposed this when it was included in the Senate's version of the Affordable Homes Act. We pushed for the governor to veto it so that we could all have a conversation about how a law like this could work, if one could work. And then after that, we pushed for a delay in implementation, identified to the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities what was really entailed here, had that pushed off initially until June 15th. Then they put out regulations saying, okay, first draft of the regulation said the law was going to be effective July 15th. Pushed further on that and finally have us out to October, gives everybody enough time to learn the law and us enough time to update our forms, the state enough time to issue their disclosure form. So been very busy on that front. We've also been doing a lot of webinars like this one. So again, kudos to you all for putting this together and as I mentioned, amending our forms to make sure that they all work under the new law come October 15th. Our Forms Content Advisory Committee has already met and reviewed our forms. made substantial changes where necessary. And really at this point, what we are waiting for before we can get those in your hands to familiarize you with them is the state to issue their state disclosure. So that disclosure from the seller to the buyer indicating that they have the right to inspect a property. That's going to be a state issued form. So we can't really move forward with our forms until we have that one. So stay tuned. We should have all of that out, I hope, next month. I think the hope is that we will see something from the state in early August on what that disclosure might look like. And then, of course, working closely with the executive office to make sure that they understand the real practical implications of the new law and how the disclosure will work.
Okay, so I think that answers JJ's question. When will the disclosure forms be available? Okay.
No guarantee on that.
Yeah,
That is,
no.
I'm guessing.
You said it. You said it. It's recorded. Anthony.
Brian, I can add a couple thoughts that Justin might be a little more hesitant to say. The regulators, I mean, they didn't say it to me, but it's pretty clear that they knew implementing this law that was, randomly stuffed into the Housing Affordable Act, I think was the name of it, from 11 months ago, wasn't really well spelled out. And that's part of the reason that implementation got delayed to the first of the year, delayed to June, now delayed to October. And I will say on the positive side, if you actually read the law, and I broke it down in a video on this page we have, mahomeinspectionlaw.com. We have all the videos I've done on it. The law and then what the regulations say, the regulations are a lot more practical and easier than what the law says, in my opinion at least. And I think that's because the regulators were kind of like, how are we going to enforce this? And I don't know if Justin wants to elaborate on that, but that was certainly my vibe. I think they were reading it kind of like, what is this? So I think on the positive side, that was good to see, and that's part of why it got delayed and delayed again, and now delayed again. But it looks like October is it.
Okay. Darryl, on the lending side, what do lenders need to watch out for, and what should the realtors be how should the realtors be keeping their lenders in the loop?
Yeah, of course. Honestly, I always look at lending compliance as a spectrum, right? So whether you're the most liberal or the most conservative, it really changes your approach to this regulation and this law in general. If I'm thinking of the more liberal lenders out there, the reality is they're not going to look at the home inspection one way or another. So they're going to look for confirmation that if it was included in the P&S, that it was done to the satisfaction of the buyer. If there's some language pertaining to either the reasonable fee or something along those lines that might come into play as to whether someone could back out because of their home inspection. They might look for language along those lines or the satisfaction of their consumer. Where it gets a little more hairy is when you see some of the more conservative lenders out there whose mindset is, I want to see a copy of the home inspection, right? Because now what you've got to be thinking in the back of your mind is safety, soundness, habitability. What might they discover? If there is language about I'm responsible for up to 10K, 20K of possible repairs. Do we have to source those assets? So to me, a lot does come into play with the type of lender you're dealing with. Are they on the liberal side or a little more conservative? Because depending on where you fall on that spectrum will really change the way you approach this new law. So to me, that's the key. Who are you working with? How do they view it? I think if you want to get a little more nuanced, lenders have to worry about disclosure requirements. I think and this will probably bore everyone to death, so I'll do this as quickly as possible. Lenders always talk about whether they should be disclosing a home inspection fee up front. Again, on the conservative side, people will disclose it every single time. Some of the more liberal lenders may not disclose it at all. I'm a big proponent of let the data speak. If the data says people are getting home inspections, you should be disclosing it. If it doesn't say that, don't disclose it. But to me, those little nuanced details really will be the main impact for your average lender. There's no new requirements of lenders that are going to change processes one way or another dramatically because of this. It's more about just being knowledgeable. And then to your point about what realtors and lenders should be thinking about and talking about, honestly, it's about what happens in real life. I think Justin touched on it a little bit when he was speaking. We can talk about the law and the regulation all we want. The reality is, how does this actually play out? Like, what are consumers actually saying? What are the agents actually talking about? I think those conversations are going to be shared anecdotally between lenders and realtors, and that's what really drives the process moving forward. So have the conversation, be educated about it, but those interactions and those explanations of how these things are actually playing out are the stories to be sharing.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Let's take a few questions. So I guess I'll open this up to whoever wants to answer it. If the This is from Tracy. If the buyer tells the seller after the offer is accepted that they are not having an inspection, do we still have to wait the 10-day time period before we can have an attorney do a purchase and sale?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So a key piece in the revised regulations is that it allows a buyer to waive the home inspection after their offer has been accepted. So in that scenario, I would put that in writing. MAR will likely have a form that does this, that just says, buyer is satisfied with the terms of the contract, and you can move forward to the purchase and sale without doing the home inspection. But that just has to come after the offer has been accepted.
Okay. Does the home inspector have to be certified? My partner's an engineer with a degree in domestic building. I would prefer to rely on him, but this might take away my rights. Anthony.
Well, I think when I hear those kind of questions, it makes me realize that people are getting too caught up on random formalities. The buyer has a right to have whoever they want inspect. And to the best of my knowledge, and Justin, am I wrong? Does the law say, the law doesn't dictate what type of inspector? It just it dictates the rights to do it, and it kind of cuts out the ability to communicate.
So this one, the law here does. So the buyer will have an opportunity to have the home inspected by a Massachusetts licensed home inspector.
I
It's
understand.
protected by the law. Anthony, as you and I both know, right? Parties can negotiate anything else that they want. So it might be that you don't have a home inspection under this law, but your contract calls for an inspection by a structural engineer, which might be more important.
But I understand, but I just want to make sure I'm clear. A buyer has a right to bring in, like you said, engineer or someone they know that's very handy. I understand the wording says that, but the buyer can bring in who they want, as long as the seller agrees.
Yeah, as long as the parties have to agree to that. But yeah, and when you see the MAR revised contract, it's going to have the same language that it has today, that it is a home inspector or anyone else in the business. So if you're concerned about structural issues, bring in a structural engineer. If it's pest issues, you can bring in a pest inspector.
Correct. That's what I was saying. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That makes sense to me. And Bryan, I can add something else. When you talked about, or Darryl talked about, the home inspection report in mortgage companies, and he was saying how the more liberal, cautious home mortgage companies, if they're asking for a home inspection report, I just want to point out something that I've trained agents on for 20 years now, really, is in Massachusetts, be careful as a listing broker or brokerage, how many details you get in that home inspection done on your listing. Because once you have that information, if that house has to go back on market, you have a bit of a higher level of disclosure expectations than sellers do in Mass. Sellers have more rights to not disclose as many things in Massachusetts as realtors do, and you can get yourself in an odd spot there. So, when I was selling, I would say, tell me what the buyer would like, if anything, or what the buyer's concerned about, if anything. I think that agents, practitioners that are doing these, should be cautious not to suddenly throw themselves into every bit of the weeds, right? The law says the buyer has a right to inspect, which, if a seller accepted it, the buyer did anyway. And you have to be careful with messaging and not letting the seller know if your buyer's not doing it. And then if you're a listing agent, being careful what you're conveying, etc. It doesn't necessarily say the whole rest of it. And I think agents should be cautious about that. Like, I know there's agents out there, when there's a home inspection done on their listing, there's some agents that are like, I want the inspection, I'm going to look at the whole thing. Well, if you do that, now you're in a situation where you may be expected to disclose certain things. And I know for the experienced agents on here, and I see a lot of experienced agents, you all know that if you have a listing go back on market and a second inspector comes in, I've seen second inspections, third inspections that didn't mention anything that the first inspector mentioned. So it can be very, convoluted, and I think you should be careful for that.
Darryl, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just to double down, because I think Anthony brings up a really good point. On the lender side, the same kind of logic applies. We can't unsee what we saw. So for the agents out there, be cautious about just delivering home inspections, especially when they're not being requested by anyone. Let an underwriter get that in their hands. They've got an obligation now to review it and ensure it says what they wanted to say or expected to say. So always be really cautious about who you're sharing that information with.
Okay, we'll take a few more because these are good questions. Can buyers opt to strike out the paragraph about the home inspection in the contract, similar to striking out mortgage contingency?
I wouldn't recommend that.
Yeah.
I think you're putting yourself in a real gray area and probably doing a disservice to your buyer, because the law says that the seller can't accept an offer where the home inspection has been waived. So if you are proactively waiving that and indicating that, then if I were a listing agent, would advise my seller not to accept that, because it puts you into this gray area of what's going to happen if you do accept it.
And it's a tough position to be in. The first video that I did on this, I joked, imagine you get an offer, $27 million over asking, and you take that offer and you go, oh, they waived the inspection on the offer. Maybe they put a line through the inspection contingency. So now you're in this odd spot. You have to tell your seller about the offer, and then you tell them, hey, even though it's 27 million over asking, you can't take it. I mean, it's completely crazy to me. And I'm interested to see how the forms are going to come out. I actually, Bryan, got this question at our Leominster branch office 2 hours ago. And I said, if you look at Greater Boston, the offer form is 1 page, and then the contingency page is another. So if someone sends you an offer with just the offer page and there's no mention of contingency, it's not included, you can surmise that, okay, maybe they're not doing it, but it doesn't explicitly say that. Well, the MAR offer form, 2 pages, includes an inspection on it. And if there's a big X through it, well, now you have a problem, like Justin just said, because that essentially is messaging that the buyer's not doing the inspection. So I'm obviously in total agreement with Justin on that. But it puts us in an odd spot. It does, and there's going to be sellers that are going to say, "What do you mean I can't take the offer?" That there's no question there are going to be sellers that have that attitude, and it's going to be interesting to see how it turns out.
A quick question out there, because it looks like Bryan may have dropped for a second, but one that I'm seeing here. How about inspection is for informational purposes only? That being in the offer, is that within the scope of the new law? What are your thoughts, Justin and Anthony?
Oh boy, I don't know if Anthony wants to go first, because I'll do 45 minutes on why I hate that phrase. Informational purposes only. Look, every home inspection is for informational purposes only. That's why you're inspecting it. You put 4 attorneys, 4 realtors, anybody on here, ask them what that phrase means, you're going to get 12 different answers. So I would not do that. There are details in the law, right? So there is, and I think this question came in, so I'll answer this one as well. You can include an aggregate amount of repairs that would need to be made before it triggers the contingency to get out. But you can't do anything that would unreasonably prohibit a buyer from backing out of the transaction if they're not satisfied with the home inspection report. So I think you need more detail than for informational purposes only. I think, as always, and this advice hasn't changed from 5 years ago, don't write informational purposes only. Include in a contract what the expectations are so that the parties understand what they are agreeing to.
Yeah, and I can elaborate on that. I always laughed when I saw that in offers, because I understand the attempt by the buyer's agent and buyer to be like, hey, we don't intend to cause trouble here unless it's something major. But if that contingency is there, the buyer can bail out of the transaction. And I like the end of what Justin said there when he said that advice isn't any different than 5 years ago. So if you as a buyer's agent want to write that in, fine. I mean, it's not gonna, it has nothing to do with the law, because the law says you can't convey if they're not doing an inspection. If they are doing an inspection and it's so-called for informational purposes, you want to write it, go ahead. But truth be told, the buyer can get out. And when you're the listing agent, you have to know that when you receive an offer like that. And my answer and Justin's answer, I don't think would have been any different 5 years ago, like he said.
Awesome. All right. Sorry, I get kicked out there for a second. I don't know, which is an awesome feeling as a moderator. It's great to automatically just be like shut down. I yelled at my wife. Maybe she didn't pay the bill. I don't know what happened, but I can't see the old questions now. They're just sort of logging in. Anthony or Justin, Darryl, any of the questions there that you think should be answered?
Yeah, there's one more here that I like a lot, so I'd love to get your thoughts on it. Really, the group's thoughts. Can there be language regarding an aggregate amount?
Yeah, so that's what I was trying to touch on there, that you can put an aggregate amount. It needs to be reasonable, and that's a discussion for another few hours on this law. But what I think is helpful is to point out, or what's easy to do is point out what's unreasonable. If you are purchasing a $1 million home and you put an aggregate amount of necessary repairs from the home inspection report at $750,000, that's not going to be deemed reasonable, right? Because if the buyer's never going to hit that number. So it's tricky, the reasonableness part, but the law does specifically allow for an aggregate amount that you have to exceed before it would trigger a contingency. And that was another change from the original regulations to the final regulations.
Okay. I like this one that just came in from Lauren, and this is probably Anthony involved in this one as well. Justin, can you please walk us through the process in the case of multiple offers? I assume one with and one without would probably be the example.
Yeah, I mean, Anthony, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, my attitude is same answer. When you get offers on a property, you should send that offer to your seller. I think what I would do if I was in a situation where I expected that we may receive multiple offers on the home, or maybe we might receive offers with no contingencies, I would let the seller know about the law on the front end, saying something to the effect of, listen, I would show them the law, because no one ever believes what they hear, they only believe what they see, but I would show them, and I would explain that if we are to receive an offer where they're conveying to me that they're not doing an inspection, that would be a problem for you to accept that offer. But I, as a listing agent and as a broker owner, I can't imagine a scenario where I would tell our agents, hey, don't forward on an offer. I mean, even if it wasn't supposed to convey something, I think you're getting into very dangerous waters if you receive an offer and you don't forward it to your sellers. And I have always been in the camp of and always taught that when you receive an offer, you forward it to your sellers. And that would be my answer. Now, this Lauren, the way she asked, can you walk us through the process? Well, no different than any other multiple offer situation. You forward them on to your seller as you receive them, right? Which is the same answer I've given for years. You don't say, if you get a seller that says, send them to me all at once, 4 days from now, I would not do that. I would send them to the seller as I receive them. And then you have a conversation with sellers about the pros and cons of the different offers. If one of them includes a big fat X over the inspection contingency clause, you're going to be forced into having a conversation about this law and how they're essentially prohibited from accepting that offer. Justin, if you disagree, speak up.
No, I would, but I didn't there.
Okay.
Now, Andy asked a good question here.
Please clarify if the buyer can write on the offer they'll be having a home inspection. That one?
Yes.
Go ahead. Yep.
Justin, you want to take it or me? Yeah, I mean, the buyer is certainly allowed to write it on the offer, and it sounds like it'll be on its own separate form moving forward. The issue is around not conveying. The lawmakers that clearly didn't know what they're doing, they are trying to prohibit the messaging and the advantage that gets created by conveying not doing a home inspection, which is insane. And I think they're all wrong, and you all can tell them I said that. But that's what we're dealing with.
Justin, Darryl, elaborate.
No, I mean, I think, I may have mentioned it, but our form is going to have the home inspection and contingency built into it. Previously, it had said delete if waived. That language will obviously be gone, so it'll be there. The expectation is that all buyers will have that opportunity to have a home inspection that they can then waive after acceptance.
Okay.
I'd just add that if you look at what the executive office kind of put out there, the law that we're talking about, really, there's some language in there that breaks down what we're expecting that disclosure to look like. Give it a read. I think that's probably a good baseline of what to expect. I think the documentation ultimately will just be formatting how it's delivered, but the wording's out there.
Okay. Just a couple of questions that we had just sort of prepared. So first of all, can they waive home inspection, and when do they have to decide whether they're waiving home inspection if you're a buyer?
So they can waive it after the acceptance. When do they have to do that? That's up to them, right? They're going to put in that offer that the buyer has 7 days to do a home inspection and notify the seller if they intend to move forward with the transaction or back out. So it's the duration of when they have to notify the seller, if they notify the seller, is contingent on how long of a period they've negotiated to have that home inspection completed.
Does anything change if the seller or buyer is not represented by an agent?
I think
Justin,
everything
you can take that one.
everything changes, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you are a consumer and you're choosing to take on a transaction like this without an experienced professional at your side, well, that's up to you. You've got to learn the intricacies and the complexities of a real estate transaction and be up to speed on them. And if you're the seller, then you need to know that you have to provide the buyer the disclosure form and provide the buyer the opportunity to have a home inspection. So the regs do include recourse against a seller who doesn't allow for that to happen. Traditionally, you think when it's business, it's 93A. So that's just business to business, Massachusetts Consumer Affairs, Consumer Protection Act. But there is, they do try and provide some recourse against a seller who violates the law as well.
Okay.
So don't do it.
Yeah, you know what I'll add too, Brian?
Sure.
I think from a lending perspective, if you're an originator out there and you're bumping into a customer who's not represented by a realtor, this is just another reason why you should be telling them about the value that realtors bring, right? You go out there, you have no knowledge about how this law could impact your offers, and before you know it, you're offering to waive home inspection with every house you put in an offer on by yourself, and you're not getting anything, you don't know why. So to me, you talk about whether that's a realtor first, LO first. This is an opportunity for an LO to really show that realtor value proposition.
Yeah, and Brian, I can go deeper here.
Please.
One of the things that I see mass confusion on, which is separate from this law, is there are still a lot of agents out there that think if a buyer comes directly to them on their listing and the buyer is unrepresented, there's a lot of agents that think that automatically puts them in a dual agency situation, and it doesn't. It doesn't. If you have no prior pre-existing relationship with that buyer, if you have no contractual relationship with that buyer, you should just be showing them the mandatory agency disclosure stating that you're representing seller, and then if they want to write an offer, you write an offer on the property. Now, the reason that person asked that question is they're asking with respect to this new law. So if the buyer tells you, hey, I don't want to do an inspection, I don't need that contingency. Obviously, if they want to write the offer, you can write it, but I think there has to be a conversation from you as the listing agent to them as the unrepresented buyer, or really even represented buyer if it was a dual agency of, hey, here's how this law works. I can't, if I convey the information, seller's going to be prohibited from taking the offer, but it's definitely an awkward conversation to be having with that buyer at that time. And I'm scratching my head on that one a little bit. So that's something that we have to think more about as we get closer to it. I've always been in the camp of, treat people the way you'd want to be treated, be fair, be transparent, be open. But this law does decrease transparency a bit, in my opinion.
Okay. Along those lines, so Robin asked a question, do we educate agents who submit an offer with a waived inspection?
If it's in the best interest of your client, yeah. And keep in mind that you could always counter an offer. So if an offer comes in and they've waived the inspection, seller can counter back and say, no, you have 7 days to do an inspection and let me know.
That's a good piece of advice there, Justin.
Yes.
Okay. Good. Oh, yes. Point. I wish I could hit the point button. All right. And then there was one to follow up on Robert's question. What should we know about what the penalties and enforcement might look like if you break one of the new law?
Yeah, so the strictest part is if a listing agent fails to provide the disclosure to a potential buyer, that is going to be viewed as a per se violation of 93A. So if there's no disclosure provided, that's all the buyer has to show, is that this listing agent and the seller never gave me the required disclosure. You violated 93A unless you can prove that that disclosure was provided. Now, originally, the state wanted to carry that same liability through any violation of the law. We backed them off of that through the regulatory process. So now it may be a violation of 93A if a seller accepts an offer where a home inspection is waived. So some real penalties out there. And I think a lot of this will come through private action in the courts. An aggrieved buyer is going to say, they're going to buy a home, they're going to waive the inspection, and then they're going to find out that there are significant repairs needed for the house. They're going to turn around, sue the seller and sue the listing agent and say, you violated the law because you didn't give me this disclosure. And then the damages can really rack up pretty quickly.
I think the only thing I'd add, Justin, just for transparency, when I hear 93A, the first thing I hear is triple damages, right?
Yeah.
Now, that's not a guarantee, but I think for everyone listening, that's what you should be thinking. And that's what the consumer who's ultimately going to be putting forward a 93A claim is thinking, and their attorney. They're thinking triple damages and attorney fees.
And those attorney's fees might be worse than the damages.
They're hearing cash registers.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Along the same lines, so we know what the penalties are. I believe there are exceptions. Justin or Anthony, you want to elaborate on what exceptions are out there to this?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll take that one. So the first exception is for new construction, but it's not all new construction. It's new construction where the contract is signed before there's substantial completion of the home. So really, when you look at it, right, there's nothing to inspect at that time, or not enough to inspect at that time. And then, of course, that new home has to include a warranty with it. So
is it a 1 year?
Yeah.
1 year warranty. Okay.
And then the other exceptions are all related to sort of non-arm's length transactions. So it's a transfer because of a divorce proceeding, estate planning when it's to a family member, and transfers because of foreclosure. So in those situations, right, the property is not really being marketed to the general public, and those ones therefore are exempt. There had been in the proposed regulations, there is exemptions, for example, for home inspectors themselves, that they wouldn't be subject to the law. Of course, when you start going down that route, you're then providing an advantage to somebody because of their occupation against the general public. So the executive office ultimately removed that exemption.
Got it. Okay.
I can add a couple thoughts to the last couple of questions. I am obviously very much in the camp of all of us following the law and doing everything we can to follow it perfectly. But I will say I've surmised from reading the regulations compared to the law that these regulators, as I said before, they're probably kind of like, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I hope, and this is probably wishful thinking, that there will be some leeway to the industry, at least in the early part of this. But like Justin said, that doesn't stop a buyer from making an action against a listing brokerage or a seller. From a regulatory perspective, I could be completely wrong. They could be strict as hell day one and want to make an example out of someone, maybe so, but my vibes tell me that they know this is a little peculiar. Justin, is that a good way to put it? I know you
Yeah, I just
talk to these
anytime you can
people.
talk about your vibes, I'm here for that answer. But yeah, so the a violation may also be a violation of license law, so that would go to our board of registration for the realtors in the room. But yeah, I think there's still some work to figure out as to how they will enforce.
Okay. And then, Darryl, I'm going to direct a question at you in the meantime, Anthony and Justin, if you want to take a peek at the chat and see if there's any questions there that we haven't addressed yet, that you think are important, let me know. But while you look at that, Darryl, what conversations do loan officers need to have with their potential home buyers?
Good question. I think in part you should always be playing the role of an educator, right? So being a part of conversations like this in advance of the go live date is really important to give you that foundational knowledge. But then as you start to navigate that home buying process with consumers, you really want to just be transparent, right? What does the law and the regulation mean for them? What impact will it have on their buying process? My original thought is probably very little. I think most LOs are already having conversations about home inspections and who they may or may not want to partner with. I know my average LO has, 3 to 5 inspectors they usually will kind of share names with. And I know most of the time some of the agents that they work with do the exact same thing. So preparing the consumer to be ready for the process is just about making sure they know what their rights are, who the best people are. I think you made a really good point, maybe even earlier when we were talking about what type of inspection too. Where's the property located? Are we worried about termites? Is there something with pests? I think when we think about inspections on a bigger scale, it's not always just the generic home inspection. It is the water well test. Like all these little tiny nuancy things to kind of keep in mind are really somewhat property specific. So if I'm in a lender, my first thought is I'm painting a broad picture of the process, the requirements, and how the world will move forward under this new rule. But then on a property to property basis, well, what should you be considering here at this place that has a septic versus public? Like I said, if it's a termite potential issue, how are you educating about the other tasks that you need to be wary of? Knowing that the agent's likely going to be right there, side by side working with you on it.
Awesome. Thank you. Anthony, any questions in the chat?
I see my pal Andy Consoli here asking some very blunt questions. Andy's an awesome home inspector, and also does license credits, and he's asking some blunt questions. And one thing, Andy, I want to say is when you say, I wish you read the law to us and broke it down step by step, I mean, Justin can speak more intelligently than me, but I am telling you, if you read the law and you read the regulations, there's some real variances between the two. I believe that my opinion is the regulations were sort of dumbed down to planet Earth a bit. So I don't know how helpful that would have been. And the other thing I want to say is, remember earlier in the meeting when Justin said how the form we're waiting on is coming from the state. So MAR can't really come out with exact guidance and exact forms until they get that from the state. And the way things have been going, we'll probably get the form on September 29th at 5 p.m. And they'll have very little time to work on it. So I know that doesn't exactly answer it perfectly, but I think the biggest thing everyone needs to be thinking about is the law is more around the conveying of the messaging of, hey, my buyer's not doing an inspection. I see lots of questions of, can we write this? Can there be an aggregate amount in the inspection? The law was put into place because they're trying to prevent sellers from accepting offers when they hear that a buyer's not doing an inspection. So obviously when they put that law in place, they know once that word's out, buyers are going to stop doing that. And that's what they're trying to prevent. So if you just think in terms of, not putting in the offer that the buyer's waiving the inspection or writing waived across the contingency page or putting a big X, that stuff is done once this law takes effect.
Justin, how about yourself? Any questions in there that?
Yeah, a couple jumped out about sort of the aggregate amount and can that be negotiated, and then also the timing of a home inspection and how long that period is. I think those are all answered by a line in the regulations that prohibits anything that would render a home inspection meaningless. So again, if you are putting an aggregate amount that is absurdly high, right? $750,000 worth of repairs on a $800,000 house, that's going to be unreasonable and render that home inspection meaningless. If you are only giving the buyer 24 hours to conduct a home inspection, that is likely also rendering that home inspection meaningless because they likely can't get a home inspector in there in that time period. Now, one of the things that the regulators tried to do was allow for parties to negotiate the terms that work for them in a transaction. And I think that's what we all need to think about is you still have that ability, but make sure you're doing it in a reasonable way. So if you are a home inspector yourself, you might say, I need a day or 2 days to do a home inspection because I can do it as soon as you let me in the house. But if you are in an area where it takes over a week, or say it takes a week to get a home inspector scheduled, and you put in 2 days, that's going to unreasonably prohibit the buyer from getting that home inspected. Now, one other one that comes up a lot for us as well is the idea of a pre-listing inspection. You can still do one, just recognize that the buyer still has to have the opportunity to have the home inspected by a home inspector of their choosing before being bound to that contract. So a pre-listing inspection might relieve concerns of buyers, but they're still going to have that opportunity to conduct the inspection. And those were the ones that stuck out to me. I will say we have an extensive FAQ section on our website, marealtor.com. So please check that out if we didn't get to one of your questions. And of course, our legal hotline open to all members Monday through Friday. So don't hesitate to reach out there as well.
I've got a quick one, Brian, that I'd love to throw to the group here. That reasonable standard is kind of referenced in two different points. One is talking about the actual cost of repairs potentially tied to an inspection. The other component, which one of the questions here also references, is when we're talking about EMD and whether some of the EMD can be withheld if someone ultimately backs out as a result of the home inspection. I'd love to hear, Justin, Anthony, your thoughts on what's reasonable when it comes to EMD. Obviously, I think the transaction, the purchase price means a lot. But that's another point that I think we have to keep in the back of our minds. There's some negotiation room with the EMD deposits too.
Yeah, but that's not any different than any other transaction or before this law. I mean, people can write whatever they want in offers when they're a buyer, whether it's earnest money deposit, closing date, contingency dates, price, and sellers can counter with anything they want. I loved what Justin said earlier about, well, seller would have the right to counter with a, hey, you do have a right to do an inspection, please do one. I thought that was a very good answer there. So I don't think deposits or those other terms really change in any way. One thing I want to add, because I just got a question texted to me by someone watching is, hey, is there anything we could have done differently as realtors? And I think that speaking as someone who was on the Massachusetts Association of Realtors Government Affairs Committee for several years, when MAR puts out a call for action, this is an example of why it's really important that everyone hits yes on those and sends the email to the lawmakers, because when Justin and the Government Affairs Committee essentially says, we need help, we need a call for action, those emails shouldn't be ignored, because I can't help but think, if we made more noise on this, would we have prevented it from happening? I can't help but think that. And, as I said, the horse is out of the barn and we have to deal with it, but just a thought.
All right. Thank you. I don't think this is one that's come up, so I'm going to ask it on behalf of my friend Jerry Bloom. What if a seller had a pre-listing home inspection and attached it to the MLS listing, and the buyer said they were happy with that? Does that change anything?
No, the buyer should still have their own laying their own opportunity in their contract to do an inspection if they choose. But again, like the buyer may be satisfied with that, but the law provides that the buyer has the opportunity to conduct the home inspection by a licensed home inspector of their choice.
Okay. I'll actually go to the phones here. Shahan, you've had your hand raised for a bit. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, please feel free.
Okay, I actually have a question. Let's say there is a property that is very desirable, and then the buyer knows that there are going to be multiple offers. So he says that I would like to do an inspection before submitting my offer, because it depends that how much I can raise my offer. Can they do that?
They can. I don't know if anybody else wants to take this one, but yeah, pre-offer home inspection, they can do it. And this is where the reasonableness standard comes into play, because they might say, all right, like I've already had my inspection by the licensed home inspector of my choosing. So within 24 hours after acceptance is enough for me to tell you. And I think the seller is going to know, hey, they still put an offer in, so they're satisfied with it. So yeah, I think you can. I think there are some quirks to that, and that's one of the unique situations that we flagged for the regulators for guidance, to make sure that people aren't inadvertently violating the law.
Okay, so it is okay. And my second question is that I also have buyers that they would like to do the inspection, and the inspector is available to do the inspection like in 24 hours after the offer is accepted. And then the mentality is, if the inspection comes good, then I go forward. If the inspection is not good, then the seller has the opportunity to put it back on the market, and I have the opportunity to go and buy the other property that I also liked. Because if I do the home inspection in 24 hours or 48 hours, then I do have the opportunity to back out and go and buy another property. So it would be the benefit to both the buyer and the seller. Can they do that, or the 7 days is mandatory?
No, they can do that. Again, so there's no set number. The original law did have a really weird, and Darryl, I don't know if you want to get into this, the regulations where they allowed 10 days after a home inspection to make a decision and notify the seller if you were walking away. There's no 10 days, there's no 7 days. There is a blank spot for a number of days that must be reasonable. So Shahan, in your example, if they have a home inspector that walks around side by side with them, and they can have that home inspected within a day after acceptance, then that is reasonable to them.
Okay.
But the seller would want to ask questions about that. So if you see an offer that comes in and says, well, I'm going to do it in 24 hours, I'd have an email out to the buyer agent saying, how are you planning to do this in 24 hours? Because we need to make sure that this is reasonable under the law.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the only thing I'd add, Justin, is that's a good example of what Anthony was speaking about the actual power of using your voice in these instances. We all saw that time frame imposed, and I think we all thought it was insane. It would delay the process of purchasing a home, undue restrictions on buyers and sellers, you name it, really. And I think we were vocal enough that the regulator starts to sit there saying, okay, maybe this doesn't need to be this way. And you start to see change that way. Now, obviously, you would have wished we would have got a little earlier ahead of it. But the reality is that's just proof that your voice does matter, and change will happen if you're vocal enough about it.
Thank you so much, Justin. Thanks a million.
Thank you, Sean. All right, Debbie, we have a stop at 3, correct? Just want to.
Yeah, unless you need a few more minutes, but yeah, that's what we promised people.
All right. Guys, can you take a few more? Can you hang off a few more, or do you get a hard stop at 3?
No, we can go more.
You take Anthony, you good for a minute, or?
Yeah, a few more minutes.
Okay, all right. So very hard to keep track of which questions have been answered or not answered. If you have we could do the raise your hand thing, so I can just kind of call on people if you want to put it in there. Unless Anthony or Justin, you see, and obviously Darryl, you see questions in there that have not been answered yet.
Well, one that I thought was an interesting question was, can someone make an offer, but in the offer promise to waive their inspection contingency 24 hours after the offer is accepted? And the creativity that agents come up with is amazing. You're all so smart and you think of so many angles. And I think everyone just needs to remember the basis of the law, which is they're trying to prevent, or not trying, the law is preventing the messaging of, hi, my buyer's not doing an inspection. That's was the intent, and that's what it's doing. And it's especially if you go to the regs, the law talks about no communication of that at all. The regs narrows it more to not within the offer, right, Justin? The regs took it down a notch, and the same with the 10-day thing post the inspection. And I didn't say that earlier because I didn't want to confuse people, but the regs made it a little bit more planet Earth. But just think of it in the sense, all these other creative things people are thinking of. Think of it in the sense of the intent and the purpose of this is to prevent the communication, specifically in writing in the offer, of my buyer's not doing an inspection, and prevent a seller, particularly in a multiple offer situation, from saying, hey, my counter offer to you 8 offers is I'll only consider the offers that waive inspection. That's now prevented. So just think of it that way. It's the prevention of the written communication according to the regs, all communication according to the law. Which do you follow? I don't know. Ask your own attorney. Call Justin. Don't ask me.
All right.
Brian, there was a request. Audrey had a question about a seller's requirement to negotiate after a home inspection. That has never been the case, right? The buyer hasn't negotiated for a contingency based on the results of a home inspection. The buyer has an opportunity after a home inspection to either move forward with the transaction or not based on that contingency. I understand in practice, there's a lot of back and forth after a home inspection, but that is not required under this law and has not been required in transactions.
All right. Thank you. Before I take Cheryl's over the phone, let me just officially say thank you to everyone for coming on. We're at the hour mark. If you need to duck off, we really appreciate on behalf of MMBA, thank you to our friends and partners over at Mass Association of Realtors. This is really enjoyed having you all here. Maybe take a few more, Anthony and Justin, if you could see if there's anything quick that can be answered in the questions. Let me go to Cheryl now. You can ask yours. And then, but thank you all for jumping on. You're free to leave. We'll take a few more questions in a few more minutes.
Thanks
Cheryl,
for taking mine. I just wanted to know, does this apply to homes that are in auction and for contractors?
Good question.
Under the 4 units, obviously.
So auctions are one of the exemptions. I think I failed to mention that. And then
No, you did. You mentioned it.
Oh, good. All right. It does apply
Auctions, foreclosures.
Yeah, it does apply to contractors, right? It's
okay.
The contractor doesn't have to have the inspection, or they might do an inspection themselves during the showing or something, but they still have the right as a buyer to have the home inspected, so they cannot proactively waive it.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Thank you. Guys, any other quick ones that we can, I saw a few in there about documents. Is MAR redrafting the offer and contingency page? You want to answer that one, Justin?
Yeah. So we have a working draft going that is amended our contract to purchase, sorry, and our purchase and sale agreement to have language in there that complies with the law. We don't have a separate contingency page. Ours are built in to the contract itself. So we'll amend ours there.
Okay. We'll do the last 2 over the phone. I got to let these guys go about their days. Tori, why don't you go first, please?
Thank you. Yeah, super quick on the earnest money deposit question. More, not so much in regards to how much that can be, but can a buyer and seller agree that it's going to be non-refundable regardless of what the inspection results are? And I know other states that do that. and, you know, it could be at any quote reasonable amount, I guess, right?
Wow.
Yeah. So I think it does come back. I know you tried to avoid the reasonableness there, but it does come back to that can be non-refundable so long as that is reasonable under the circumstances. So again, you're buying a $1 million home and the non-refundable deposit is $500,000. Well, now any home inspection is useless, meaning it's been rendered meaningless. So there is a lot that's going to come back to that reasonableness standard. So it can be non-refundable, but you don't want it to be so high as to make it rendering the inspection itself meaningless.
Yeah, I think I'd just add that 100% of the EMD might also be pushing that reasonableness standard, short of it just being a low figure, right? And even then, I could see how someone might say, well, 100% of 5,000 is still unreasonable, right? So I think that's a really delicate topic to kind of touch on.
All right. And then lastly, let's go to Lauren Delaney. Just unmute yourself. Please ask your question.
Yes, thanks. It's a kind of a two-part question, I guess. You were mentioning before about, the seller can't really unsee an offer when they've seen an offer that's waiving an inspection clause, even though, it might be a fabulous offer, multiple bucks over asking price, whatever, and it's waived. And we, as a broker, tell them that there could be a problem with them accepting that offer with the clause waived. Well, the seller has the final decision. We're not a party to the contract. If the seller decides they want to go ahead and accept that offer, where is my liability? I mean, are they able to put me on the line of fire like that when they choose to accept the offer? So that's the first part. Second part is if you're dealing with like an estate sale or somebody a seller that says, I want to sell the property as is. How does this still work? That they have the right to do the inspection, but just tell the seller they don't have to accept any negotiation for it? I mean, they can't really refuse the buyer the right to do the inspection, even if they're advertising it as is. Correct?
Right.
Right. So on the as is portion, right, the seller has never had to negotiate. You can still sell a home as is. The buyer just has the opportunity to do that home inspection and see if they want to move forward with the house as is. Short-term memory loss. I forgot the first question. So if anybody else remembers it and wants to jump in, feel free. Liability. Anthony, you want to? Yeah.
No, I was going to say I have to jump off.
Yeah.
Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Anthony.
you.
Liability is going to come down to your actions as an agent. If you have provided the required disclosure form that has notified the buyer of their right to have the property inspected, you've done step one of protecting yourself from the strict liability of 93A. If you do that and then tell your seller, but hey, look, you could probably still accept that, like, you're going to open yourself up to liability. So you just want to be advising your seller that they would be violating the law. And that is one of the steps we try to take through our lobbying on the regulations to remove some of that liability from the agent. You as the agent have the liability for the form, but you can't be held liable for the actions of your principal, right? You are the agent of the principal. Principal is going to make that decision, not the agent. So you just need to show that you had advised your principal, your client, in accordance with the law. Doesn't mean you're not going to get in the line of fire, though.
I think the only thing I'd add, and certainly not trying to offer legal advice in any capacity.
Neither am I, by the way.
Yeah, I would like to touch on that, right? I think where you get into trouble is when it becomes the old he said, she said, right? So if you find yourself in a position where you're uncomfortable, you've communicated the information to the buyer you were supposed to, you've communicated to your seller what they can and can't do, and for whatever reason, that seller side decides to go against your advice, there's always value in finding a way to document the fact that I delivered this advice on whatever day, however you see fit to do so.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you both. We're 10 minutes over. Debbie, anything you want? I know one of the questions was, will this be recorded and sent out? Can you answer that?
Yes, absolutely. I will be sending out a link to MAR for everyone that registered on their end and from everyone who registered under the MMBA.
Okay, and then there are a lot of questions here we unfortunately just didn't have time to answer, but I would imagine, Justin, I think you alluded to it earlier, a lot of these, there's a Q&A somewhere
Yeah.
or frequently asked questions. Where can they find that?
That's right on our website. We have a dedicated page to home inspections. So if you go to marealtor.com, I'm going to guess it's like /home inspection, but it's one of the key drop downs because of how many questions we've got. It has all of our webinar recordings that we've been allowed to share on there. It has the FAQs. It'll have the disclosure form and PDFs of our forms once they're available.
Okay. All right, Debbie, anything you want to end with?
No, I just thank you so much for our panel, for all of the hard work you put in. And thanks to everyone who joined us.
Awesome. All right.
All right.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank
Everyone
you.
have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.